not one of the most optimistic vis-a-vis the Constitutional Committee for a number of reasons. First of all, we understand that it is a process that's going to be very long, very drawn out. And there's no doubt that the regime has the upper hand in that it has the 50 members on the regime side. There are 50 members on the opposition side, but there's also 50 members from civil society, most of whom are coming from Damascus on the same plane as the regime when they come to Geneva to discuss. The concept is a noble one, that since we are not able to solve the problems another way, let's get everybody together to sit down and work on a constitution so that everybody feels that they're included. But that's not knowing how the Syrian regime works. In the year 2000, mere hours after the original dictator Hafez Assad had died and it was announced to the Syrian people, the Syrian parliament was convened and the Syrian constitution was changed in 5 minutes, live, televised to Syria and to the rest of the world, changing the age of the requirement for the presidency. At the time it had been 40 and it was brought down to 34 so that Bashar Assad could officially and legally become the president. Historically, the constitution has meant very little for Syria and for Syrians. Therefore, while outside of Syria, in Western democracies, it makes perfect sense to have a legal document upon which all Syrians can lean and feel represented, the reality is that even if we succeed in having the most perfect constitution, everyone knows that what is written on paper means nothing in real life. So that is why I'm pessimistic about the options, about the possibilities from that constitution, but also, realistically speaking, it is a pity that the international community and the Security Council have decided that this is the only crumbs that they are throwing the Syrians in exile within Syria and of all factions. I believe that the Syrian opposition has been treated extremely unfairly and had impositions which were really impossible to fulfill from the very beginning. From the very beginning, they were told you have to be unified, you have to be equally representative, you have to know how the process works, when they were coming out of a dictatorship of over 30 years and had never had the chance to even give their opinions, let alone sit and find a way to establish consensus on various issues. So the first few years were lost with very noble and perhaps less noble people in the Syrian opposition trying to prove not to their people and not to themselves, but trying to reach this level which really only exists in utopia. When you look at politics today in the world, when you look at American politics, and you see the divisions not only on a bipartisan line, but even within parties. Look at the followers of people like Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren and Joe Biden, and you will see the complexities of what is a democratic process. Syrians were not given that chance. They were forced to appear polite and to appear in agreement, and disagreement is good. We had 30 years of dictatorship where everyone was forced to have to toe the line to say the same thing. When these people finally found their voices, to be obliged to appear united when there was no unity yet, to be obliged to comply with specifications which were not relevant then and there, I think that this took the wind off their wings. They were found perhaps in a rut, trying to satisfy some utopian definition of opposition, when in fact they had a lot of different points of view which could have been taken, put together, and could have formed a viable alternative from the very beginning. Yes, there were people who had ideologies that we may or may not agree with, but it is their right to have that opinion, and that opinion one day would have been put with all the other opinions in the ballot box. Syrians were not afforded that opportunity in the last few years. Whenever you read a piece about Syria, you do not find anymore quotes by respected and respectable Syrian voices who do represent different fragments of Syrian society. Now we hear from Syrian experts and we hear from officials, but not anymore from this body of people, some of whom have suffered tremendously in regime jails, others who found their voices now. And I think we need to go back today to ask all the people who consider themselves involved in some way in the future of their country, to ask them what they want. These are also the opposition, and their names and their voices must be taken into account. First of all, to drop all these demands, which are extremely idealistic, but completely irrelevant to reality. We keep talking about the rights of minorities and the so-called majority and representation from, the dozens of different denominations we have in Syria, whether on a religious or on an ethnic ground. We need to consider every Syrian as a citizen, and this is an argument I've made repeatedly over the years. And there's a certain Orientalist perspective in forcing Syrians and others in the region to say, no, you have to make sure that, segment A and segment B are represented. But if we were to consider every Syrian as a citizen with equal rights, in a place where rule of law applies and where accountability has been achieved from everyone, then nobody needs to feel that they are in a majority or in a minority or that they need protected status. And that is, again, a mistake which I believe the international community committed from the beginning of the revolution and the ensuing conflict, in that they tried to impose certain criteria which are only imposed on the region. There is no need for that. I think especially after 9 years, Syrians are well aware and understand what are the international parameters that constitute a democracy, constitute a country where everyone's rights and duties are protected. And this is when you bring the concept of citizenship, which remains absent from all discussions on Syria when we go into tangents and veer on the minorities and making sure that there's no revenge. If you have a constitution which is applied where rule of law applies to everybody, then I don't think we need to worry about the protections for whatever the group is. This is my biggest concern right now, that we go back to the beginning and impose that concept of citizenship where you and I and the neighbor that we do not like have the exact same rights. A lot of the Syrians who have been forced to leave their homes in Syria, and a lot of Syrians who by chance happen to be already in other countries, find themselves between a rock and a hard place right now. On one hand, they are not anymore suffering the same fate as their compatriots in Syria, but on the other, they are all feeling this collective pain and anguish at what's happening in the country. I believe they're having a really hard time finding their place. There are some of us who are writers, who are involved in policy-making circles. We find we have a voice, but a lot of other Syrians find that they don't know where to place themselves. There is no electoral process, so they cannot participate. But what they can do, and what they have done, is get involved with one another, get involved with NGOs, with civil societies, with academia. This has been important. But I think there's one more step that we need to take collectively as Syrians in diaspora, and that is to get involved in local politics of every country. Here in the UK, they need to acquaint themselves with the process, to acquaint themselves with their respective MPs, to find out what their rights are and what measures different people in the governments have been taking. I think that the nature of the regime in Syria and in the region indeed has not accustomed most people to take initiative in these issues. I think there's a huge role still for Syrians to play, not only in Syria and within the contours of what remains as the state, but in the countries where they are, in the European Union, in the UK, in the US, and in the neighboring countries. They have a voice, and it is a voice that matters because it informs and it hopefully will be considered in policymaking circles.